Did you know about Mrs Chant, Mrs Laura Ormiston Chant, 1847 till 1973? Mrs Chant was a mother, a member of the general public, and a self-appointed moral watchdog. I suppose she was the Mary Whitehouse of her time. You have heard of Mary Whitehouse. Well, you will have done if you're of a certain age. About my age, in fact. But this isn't about Mary Whitehouse. This is about Laura Ormiston Chant, who was like Mrs Whitehouse in many ways. A busybody, if you ask me, but probably had her heart in the right place, as wanting to protect us all, but more particularly, perhaps, the younger generation, from the seedier side of life. Although, to be honest, and in my case certainly, not everyone wanted to be protected from the seedier side of life. After all, that seems to be where all the fun is. Excuse me. Well, anyway, where was I? Ah, yes. I'm going to tell you about Mrs Chant and the Empire Theatre, Leicester Square, and how Mrs Chant tried to have it closed down. This was way back in 1894, by the way, so I don't want you all getting worked up about it. It's over, in the past. Although, sadly, in my view, the Empire is no longer a theatre. It's a cinema these days. But at least it hasn't been demolished or turned into a, let's just say, a place of worship. Not yet, anyway. I mean, cat's just got up on my desk. Bonnie, you can't go down. That's it, sorry. Sorry about that, the cat tried to jump on the computer keyboard. Anyway, I'm drifting off the point again. Where was I? Come on, John, get it together, man. The Empire had not been doing too well. Plays and opera had been losing their appeal. The shareholders were unhappy. Something had to be done. This is where the problems began, because the Empire's management started to put on variety shows with, horror of horror, dancing girls. But this wasn't what Mrs Chant was most worried about. Oh no, what was causing her most concern was what was going on at the back of the dress circle. Mrs Chant believed it was a den of open prostitution. She told Middlesex County Council that unless steps were taken to put a stop to this, she would raise a strong objection at the next meeting of the licensing committee. To be fair to Mrs Chant, there had been concerns raised before, so she may have had a point. Young men were strongly advised not to visit the Empire. You can imagine the notice most young men took of that bit of advice. One of those young men, by the way, was Winston Churchill. You may have heard of him. He got a letter from his nanny. Nannies were important to posh people, asking him not to go to the Empire. She wrote telling him to keep away from bad companions and specifically not to go to the Empire Theatre. It can only lead to wickedness and bad things, she said. He didn't take any notice of her words, and neither did the Empire management. So Mrs Chant put in her objection to the council. She told the council meeting that she had put on her prettiest frock and was accosted by men behind the Empire's dress circle. One man had asked to see her underwear. Outrageous. The stage show had given great offence, and some people had walked out because of bawdy songs. Mr Edwards, who was one of the management team, said that everything was strictly vetted, but that some things must have been overlooked. Mrs Chant was supported in her campaign by the YMCA, but there were also strong opponents like the London Cab Drivers Union and the man who stood bail for Oscar Wilde, the Reverend Stuart Headlam. Another opponent of Mrs Chant was the novelist Mrs Helen Matthews, who suggested that nature, by creating an excess of women over men, seemed to say that men should have special privileges. She was called a harlot by the journalist W.T. Steed. I'm not sure what that was all about. Mr. Edwards, the theatre manager, suggested that prostitutes would be driven onto the streets if the theatre closed. That sounds like an admission of guilt, if you ask me. The Middlesex County Council refused to renew the Empire's licence by a majority of 43, and the Empire closed its doors to a tableau of dancing girls and a rousing chorus of Rule Britannia. The Methodist Times called it a great defeat of lying and lust, and described the Empire's supporters as the very epilepsy of licentiousness. Sporting Times described Mrs Chant as a nasty-minded busybody and a member of the Shrieking Sisterhood. She was burned in effigy at a mass meeting in Hyde Park, but she was well received at a meeting in the Queen's Hall. "I'm 47 years old," she said, "and I'm proud of it." It all turned out to be a farce about nothing. The Empire Theatre was back in business a week later. There was a riot on the opening night. One of those who took part was Winston Churchill, who used the occasion for his maiden speech. He wrote to his brother, "Did you see the news about the riot at the Empire last Saturday? It was I who led the rioters and made a speech to the crowd. My cry was, 'Ladies of the Empire, I stand for liberty.'" And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this story, and thank you for listening. See you again soon, I hope. Bye for now. Bye.